Thank you, Luke. Okay, so I'd like to welcome everyone to our special session today on minds and algorithms. How does AI shape human cognition? Just a heads up that the session is being recorded because it's a webinar. If audience members put questions in the Q&A, others will not be able to see who wrote the questions, and people watching the recording later on will also not be able to see that. So your privacy will be preserved. I'd like to, first of all, introduce myself. My name is Julia Spaniel, and I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology here at Toronto Metropolitan University. I'm also serving as the Interim Associate Dean of Research and Graduate Studies in the Faculty of Arts. And I have a co-host today for the session, Dr. Valerie Deacon. Valerie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Valerie Deacon. I'm currently the Manager of Academic Support and Curriculum Innovation in the Faculty of Arts at TMU. I'm a historian by training, but have recently become interested in AI as it relates to teaching and learning. So I'm really excited for this session.
Great. Thank you, Valerie. And before we introduce our special guests, I'd like to acknowledge the land. Toronto Metropolitan University sits on territory that has been home to Indigenous peoples for more than 15,000 years. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share and protect this land. We are grateful to live and work on this territory, and we recognize the unique privilege and responsibility that comes with being researchers, teachers, and learners living on this land. So our session today deals with artificial intelligence, or AI, and AI has been around for quite some time, but ChatGPT, which dropped in late November, an online chatbot, has really created a huge stir, and this sort of excitement and mixed with fear in some quarters shows no sign of abating. Just yesterday, OpenAI, the company that created ChatGPT, released a new version called GPT-4, which is even more powerful than its predecessor. And as we grapple with these developments as citizens and members of a university community, it's a good idea to step back and think a little bit about what we already know and what different academic disciplines have to say about this phenomenon. And to that end, today we're very lucky to have two such experts with us. And I think, Valerie, you were going to introduce Karina.
Yes, so we're really thrilled to have Dr. Karina Vold here with us. Karina is an assistant professor at the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology at the University of Toronto. She is also a research lead at the U of T Schwartz Reisman Institute for Technology and Society, a faculty associate at the U of T Center for Ethics, and an associate fellow at the University of Cambridge's Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence. And her recent research has focused on human autonomy, cognitive enhancement, extended cognition, and the risks and ethics of AI. So welcome, Karina.
And our second special guest is Dr. Carl Spooner. Carl is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology here at TMU. His research focuses both on improving the quality of learning experiences in educational settings and understanding how societal concerns impact the way people think about and respond to the future. Thank you for joining us, Carl. So once again, audience members, if questions come up as we hold this conversation, please put them in the Q&A, and we will try to get to them towards the end. So Carl, I'm going to start with you. This is a home game for you, so we'll throw the first question over to you. You're a cognitive psychologist. I'm also a cognitive psychologist, for full disclosure. And so you study learning, memory, future thinking in humans, and all of those functions form part of what we understand to be our human intelligence. Can you give us a little overview of what we know so far as cognitive psychologists about how these functions actually work in humans?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thanks, Julia and Valerie, for organizing this event, and I'm definitely happy to be a part of it today. So yeah, for learning, memory, and future thinking, yeah, there's a lot I can say about that. Maybe the one thing that I thought that I could highlight just for the purposes of our conversation today is that these concepts are very related to one another, and maybe more so than people sometimes realize. And so maybe like a very straightforward example, and one that's more obvious, is the relationship between learning and memory. We have an experience in our day-to-day lives that we then retain in memory. At some future point in time, we might retrieve that information from memory when it's useful to us, and then it could be said that we've learned from our past and use that information in an adaptive way. And that relationship is really based on things that we experience directly in our day-to-day interactions. Future thinking takes this a step further. It allows us to take advantage of this relationship in the absence of any real direct experiences in a traditional sense. So for instance, I can imagine some event that has not yet happened in my life. I can anticipate what it might make me feel like. These things that I'm simulating about the future, I can then store in memory. So in essence, I can form memories of the future in some sort of total recall way, if that's a reference that anyone gets, because that's a pretty old movie. But then I can hold on to that information and make use of it down the road and decide, oh, is this something that I still want to pursue in terms of my goals and aspirations for my future? Is this something I want to continue planning for or not? And again, the idea is that I can create these associations outside of direct experience. And in some ways, I think many people believe that this is something that separates us from other animals, that we can sort of abstract from our thoughts in ways that it's not tied to what we've directly experienced, but we can actually anticipate what the world might look like in a way that's not related to what we experience.
Okay, thanks. So just a quick follow-up. So you're describing this ability to think about the future, this presumably uniquely human ability to think about the future in a way that's kind of generative or creative, that goes beyond just recombining past experiences. Is that kind of the essence of what you just said, that we're able to imagine new things?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wouldn't say that it's necessarily uniquely human, but the complexity with which we're able to do this and the level of abstraction that we're able to do this, as far as we know, is something that we think defines us as humans and what allows us to create civilizations and societies, because we can sort of anticipate what the causes of what the results of our actions will be. And yeah, one other thing that you mentioned that I think is important is that the way that future thinking works is that we really are in some ways building off our memories are our building blocks for the future, right? So when you look at neural activity, when people remember the past, imagine the future, it's the same. When you ask an amnesic individual who has lost access to their past experiences to imagine what their future might be like, they can't answer those questions. They just say that their mind is blank because they can't access those building blocks. And so in many ways, it is tied to our past experiences, but at the same time, we can use that information to create things that we know haven't been there before and that are not tied to what we've experienced, if that helps.
Great, thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm actually really looking forward to maybe coming back to this a little bit later in the conversation, perhaps in relation to the conversations people have had with Bing's Sydney, that chatbot, and kind of how it ties into what you've just said. But maybe before we get there, Karina, I was hoping that you might be able to tell us just a little bit about what is artificial intelligence? How did this term come about? What is its current meaning? And why are philosophers interested in AI?
Great, absolutely. So yeah, thank you both as well for hosting us. So there is a long history of this term, artificial intelligence. Even before the term itself was coined, there were people thinking about AI, even if they weren't using that term precisely. So that's going back at least to the 1800s with people like Charles Babbage and Ada Lovelace. But I believe the term itself was coined in a paper in around 1955, which is a famous paper. It's a short paper that I recommend to all my students. It's a proposal for funding, research funding. So it's called the Dartmouth Summer School research funding proposal by 4 thinkers who have been called the kind of fathers of AI. This is John McCarthy, Marvin Minsky, Nathaniel Rochester, and Claude Shannon. And in that paper, they proposed that they would be able to make significant progress on building a machine that could basically accomplish all the sort of intellectual feats that humans can accomplish. And it was for like a couple months of research. So they were quite ambitious, and obviously turned out to be quite wrong about how challenging it was. But in the paper, they coined the kind of term AI, and they say a machine is intelligent if it can behave in ways that would be called intelligent if a human were so behaving. So they give a kind of formulation that ducks, in a sense, whether these abilities might indicate some underlying intelligent competence or underlying knowledge, but focus instead on performance capacities of the machine. So it's a definition that philosophers, often would take issue with because it doesn't sort of look inside the black box, and it evaluates something entirely on its external performance. But it has been a really influential definition. Nowadays, I would say the term AI gets used in an even sort of more loose sense. So when we talk about AI, it will include any approach that attempts to make machines perform intelligently. So something kind of similar. But when we're talking about AI today in 2023, what we're often referring to are new techniques that have emerged in a subfield of AI called machine learning, which is a field that aims at getting machines to learn and solve problems, usually from large amounts of data. Sometimes using other techniques like reinforcement learning, where the agent learns from a reward signal using trial and error rather than a huge corpus of data. But also that's typically coupled with what's called deep learning. So models systems that model data with many layers or deep neural networks. So that's very broad about how it gets used, this term. Now, in terms of why philosophers are interested in it, I think there's actually been a long history of intersecting with philosophy of mind and philosophy of cognitive science, which are my areas of research, and artificial intelligence. So questions that we used to teach, 5 or 10 years ago, the Turing test, and sort of figuring out whether or not machines could ever be intelligent. So early on, there were these kind of metaphysical questions about, what should count as a machine, what should count as artificial, what should count as intelligent, what makes an object a computing object versus a non-computing object. How do we distinguish between things like weak and strong artificial intelligence? Those were the kinds of questions that kind of dominated philosophers' interest in AI maybe 10, 15 years ago. As of more recently, there's a lot more, I think, areas of interest that intersect. So these include things like questions in epistemology, so whether or not systems can know or whether or not systems can advance our knowledge in some way. Also questions in moral philosophy. So, when do we really consent to using these systems? Who has access to our private data or data sets? How is that information being shared? Questions around explainability. So what counts as a good explanation? It's a kind of philosophical question. We often think about that in science as well, like what counts as a good scientific explanation. But now we're curious about how do these machines work? So how do we get a good explanation of how these machines make a decision? There's also sort of moral, political questions around fairness and bias. So how do we assess the societal harms of these systems and different types of technological systems that use some capacity of AI? Who's responsible if things go wrong? So sort of classic examples of the self-driving car and who where should the blame go? Is new technology being compliant with these existing laws and regulation, or do we need new existing laws and regulation? Who should be governing these different systems? So now there's many different sort of subfields of philosophy that have taken up interest in AI, in part because of how general purpose it is and how widespread it's being used. So it kind of goes far beyond just the philosopher of mind, like myself.
Thanks. That's really interesting. Like, as you're talking about this, I'm thinking to myself, like, the concept of machine learning, I think, is so abstract to most people that my sense is that there actually isn't a very like robust understanding of the very real consequences that you were just talking about that, you know, machine learning or AI has in the real world, like self-driving cars, or even kind of like our ethical questions about the infrastructure that's required to sustain these large machines that are learning. So I find this really fascinating. Thank you. Carl, now that we know that AI has been a part of our life, probably even longer than most of us realize, could you give us some examples of how AI has changed or is changing the way we use our minds in our daily lives?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, there's probably countless examples that we could go over here. I'll maybe just cherry pick a few that I think maybe highlight a little bit about how it's changing how we're using our minds. You know, a very straightforward example that I think we all experience now is that when I compose an email, I'm not necessarily spending as much time doing it or thinking it through as maybe I did before, because now there's an algorithm that's predicting what my next sentence should be, and that algorithm gets a little bit better every time. And maybe it's only saving me a few seconds, but I'll take it, sort of thing. And so I think that's maybe one example. I'm old enough to remember what it was like to drive cross country with only the aid of a physical map. And that's obviously not anything that we do now. We have GPS that allows us to stay focused on the road and not have to keep thinking about the fact that, oh, am I going the right way? Am I not? Maybe I should go check the map again. Do I need to stop to check the map again or not? So I think in that way, again, we're sort of, we're using our mind less in that sense, but I think if that's a good or bad thing depends on how we look at it, right? I think it's a good thing in that I'm not as distracted while driving as maybe I used to be in those contexts. Am I going to remember how to get from point A to point B if I use GPS? Probably not. And I think that's something we all experience as well, that all of a sudden you don't have GPS to tell you how to get to some place that that you just went, then we realize that, oh, like that's just not going to happen unless I'm actually paying attention and doing the navigating myself. And maybe just another quick example that Julia alluded to earlier, just, you know, with things like ChatGPT, you know, if students figure out ways to use these things for assignments, then they're obviously not using their mind as much as they would have before, and that's obviously not going to be a very good thing. But again, I think it just really depends on how people use these types of technology. And I think there's like a really nice column in Toronto Met today about the impact of ChatGPT on education, and some really nice discussions around the fact that we could be afraid of this technology, or we could just figure out how to make better assignments and make people use these type of technology in a way that'll make them think critically about the information that they're using. So yeah, I think it's changing how we're using our mind, in the sense that maybe we're using it less. I think in many cases it's making us more efficient in the types of things we want to do day to day, and that we always just want to be mindful of, if I'm offloading a task onto AI or any other technology, what might be the ramifications of that for myself in terms of what any knowledge that I'm gaining or not gaining.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Carl, you used the word offloading, and I think that's going to come up again. It's also, I think cognitive offloading has entered colloquial speech. I'm familiar with the term from our discipline, from research articles and whatnot, but I now see it in newspaper articles. So I think the idea that we are putting some of the cognitive load that we experience in our day-to-day lives, we're externalizing that load, we're making it somebody else's or something else's problem. That is an idea that increasingly, I think, the public is aware of and grapples with. And actually, my next question for you, Karina, is, and I looked a little bit at your publications and at your scholarly work as a philosopher, and I noticed that you don't necessarily say cognitive offloading, you call this the extended mind. And I don't know if those two terms are the same, probably not. There are probably many distinctions. But maybe you could just talk to us a little bit about what you mean when you say extended mind, and kind of give us a sense of the benefits and potential downsides of an extended mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So the term extended mind was coined, or extended cognition, you sometimes hear in philosophy by two well-known philosophers, Andy Clark and David Chalmers, in 1998. So they wrote a really influential paper called The Extended Mind. It made a big splash in philosophy of cognitive science. It became one of the most cited papers in the last 20 years or something in philosophy. So it had a ton of literature kind of spill out of the paper. And it was provocative. So in some ways, the extended mind thesis is radical, and maybe more radical than what the cognitive offloading term entails. So when we say that the mind is extended, we mean that parts of the tools, sort of non-biological tools that we use, have become a literal part of your mind, in the sense, part of the machinery of your mind, so that they're on a par with your brain in terms of like their physical status in constituting the mind. So the classic example that Clark and Chalmers gave involved a character named Otto, who, instead of relying on his internal memory, he wanted, you can imagine you want to go to let's say OCAD, or see an art exhibit. And instead of remembering and recalling where that information is, in the way that Carl was describing that we so often do, in the case of Otto, he has a poor memory, we're meant to imagine. So he suffers from Alzheimer's disease. And what he's done is written down all this important information in a notebook that he carries around with him everywhere he goes. And so when he thinks, I want to go see this exhibit, he looks up the address of the exhibit in his notebook, and then he uses that to direct his actions. So you can kind of follows the sort of standard belief, desire, action type of model, right? He has a desire to go somewhere. He has a belief of where the museum is, and that guides his actions of where to go. The only difference is that instead of holding that information, instead of it being instantiated in some pattern of activities and neurons in our brain, is that for Otto, it's instantiated by written symbols in his notebook. So so the view is literally saying like physical states that are located beyond the brain. So physical non-biological states, usually states that carry information. So external symbols can partially constitute an agent's cognitive states, or their beliefs or desires, and so forth. So it's radical for a few reasons, because it rejects the idea that your mind is just your brain, which a lot of people, if you ask them, where's your mind, right? They would say like, well, it's somewhere in here. It's pretty much all here. So this view is saying like, no, that's wrong. It's not all there. This is a neuro-chauvinistic bias that we have, where we're assuming that neurons are what matters. And actually there's way more that matters to our minds and our cognitive information processing than just our brains. And of course, in 1998, they were talking about like a physical notebook with a pen and paper. And nowadays, like what we all have, I would say, is this. You can see my phone, right? So I challenge most people in the audience right now to reach for their phones. It's probably within an arm's length of you, right? You have it literally with you all the time. Yeah. Thanks, Julia. Thanks, Valerie. Yeah. So the evidence is that, something like our smartphones, which uses AI extensively in various ways, is literally taking over some of the functions of our brains. So if you think about, Carl mentioned being old enough to remember using physical maps, me too. So when I moved across to Toronto to start my undergraduate degree, I drove myself across the country, and I didn't have a smartphone. I used paper maps. And nowadays, one doesn't have to do that, right? Back then, I used to have all my family's phone numbers memorized. I had my friends' phone numbers memorized. Now I don't do that. It's all in my phone. So there's certain functions, there's things that I used to have to do with my brain that are literally just being taken over by the phone. So you can see that as a kind of offloading. I think it counts as offloading, but to say that it's counts as extended cognition means that you're recognizing the metaphysical status of the phone as being on a par with the brain, which philosophers think is important for some philosophers think is important for various reasons I won't go into. So what's interesting about this is that our phones now have much more sophisticated capacities than just a pen and paper. And they're using AI in all these sorts of ways that we sometimes don't even really recognize. So whether it's, to help us navigate or to go through like, spam filtering our emails, facial recognition just to get into the device, finding Google search information, storing all of our passwords, you name it. So there's lots of different features. The way we take pictures is using AI. So they're taking better photos using AI. There's a lot of functions that we don't even fully recognize because they're sort of behind the scenes. And I think that that's really powerful. So Carl had also mentioned the fact that some of our tasks are changing, right? So there's some evidence. We had heard when Google was, first becoming really popular, and there were studies about, is Google making us forgetful? Some of these famous studies, people like Betsy Sparrow and her colleagues did some research on this, and what they found were participants who recognized that information that they would need in order to complete some task. If they knew that information would be available to them, they would be less likely to remember the information itself and more likely to remember how to find that information, right? So what's that suggesting is that it's changing some of these technologies, maybe not just sort of taking over our brain functions, but changing what we need to do with our brains. So the fact that I don't have to remember all my friends and family's phone numbers means that I do have to remember passwords. I have to remember how to access those things. I have to remember how to charge my phone. But also it frees up a little bit of cognitive space, right, to do other things. So there's other things that I might need to store in my long-term memory that I didn't have to before, or that I couldn't before because I was focusing on other things. So there's definitely a sort of a changing of what sort of cognitive resources we're using, and sort of how those technologies are altering what the tasks are that are confronting us. So like Carl had said as well, the fact that we can use GPS now means that we're not maybe as distracted while we're driving. We don't have to pull over as much, which is great. Maybe we can focus on other things while we're driving. So so that's what the extended mind refers to.
Great, thank you.
I addressed all your question, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, it was a big question, but I think all these concrete examples are very useful, especially when we're talking about philosophical concepts that are or psychological, scientific concepts that are kind of alien to us. We might have heard about them, but they're not really the way we think about these things in our everyday lives. So populating that with lots of examples is really, really helpful. And I noticed that you really you're not taking sides. You're not saying this is good or bad. It's sort of neither. It could be, it is useful, but it's not inherently good or bad.
Right.
Is that fair?
Yeah. So some philosophers, and I am sympathetic to this view, that part of what makes us distinct, we love these hypotheses of what makes humans distinct, but something that we seem to be really good at is offloading. So for example, Andy Clark, the philosopher I mentioned, says that we're the offloading ape. We're the ape that's really good at offloading our like dirty, boring cognitive labor onto the environment. And we're really good at making tools and putting symbols into the world so that we don't have to just be tied to our limited cognitive resourcing. So like, this is a pretty small computer. It has to fit on my neck, which isn't that strong. It has to fit through my mother's birth canal, which isn't that big. So it's like got some brute limitations to it. But now that we can start offloading all these symbols into the world, so basically like the invention of language and the invention of like numerical systems where we can do all of these fancy manipulations in the world of these symbols, that's really powerful. And that's led to all these other like higher order types of thinking. So I think in a broad sense, it's a very good thing that we've been able to do this. When we look at really specific technologies, I think there's always two sides. So we can be a little more nuanced when we start to look at specific technologies about whether or not it's overall good or overall bad, or what are the goods and bads. But I think in general, the fact that we're able to offload in this way into these external symbols and tools is extremely powerful for humans.
Great. Yeah. So I think, Karina, you've already partially started to answer my next question, which was a question I was going to pose to both you and Carl. Do you think AI and these fancy AI tools we now have are making us smarter or dumber? It's an intentionally dumb question, but I think it is at the heart of what we worry about often. That is this? Yeah, GPS is great, but am I losing some kind of mental capacity? Is this making me lazy? And is my brain shrinking here? Maybe over to you, Carl. What do you think, and what does the science say?
Sure. I think it's like most things. It really depends on how we ask the question and what we're asking it about. Because I think, there's, to the extent that we are offloading our tasks onto machines, that I'm not going to develop any strong cognitive map of the greater Toronto area. If every time I go somewhere, I'm just using GPS to let me do that, right? And we know that there's a lot of research from Eleanor McGuire and their colleagues at the UCL that when we use our brain to navigate, the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that is centrally involved in allowing you to do this, you can say it becomes large, it develops. So taxi drivers in the UK have larger hippocampi than people in the average population, because this is something they're doing all the time. At the same time, it's very useful. And so one thing that I think about that is, like, I wonder if, like, the word smarter is the better word, or just more efficient. That it's I can understand what my limitations are, and technology. And I think that's one thing that technological developments really highlight. They sort of serve as a mirror for what we are good at, but we're also, what are our limitations? What are we not very good at? As far as we know, the human brain is one of the more advanced computing systems in the universe, but it has some very severe limitations in terms of what we can do. So to Karina's point about offloading memory, right? That I'm going to write down in a notebook the things I need to do later today, because if without that, I might forget. The one thing I want to say about that is, I hope maybe we can develop, like, I sometimes feel like I got to make notes to check the notebook, because then I'll forget that, like, oh, it's in my calendar, but I forgot to check my calendar. So there's still limits to, but again, it just highlights, here are things that we are not very good at doing. And this is where technology can step in and help us to be more efficient in how we interact with our day-to-day lives. And so again, I think it just depends on how you look at it. But yeah.
If I may jump in, one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is whether or not there's, like, some sort of core skills that we don't want to offload, but at least before we develop them internally. So I think going back to this kind of GPS navigational example, right? So it sounds like all of us who are speaking, whoever camera's on, are old enough to have learned how to navigate with a map initially, and now we've sort of transferred and offloaded that skill onto our devices. So now we're like, okay, we understand how maps work, but I'm just going to let the system do that kind of, like, heavy work for me. So what happens to, like, the next generation, my niece and nephew, when they don't even bother, there's no learning of how to navigate on the map to begin with, they just go straight to the offloading. So I had, like, an encounter the other day where someone was dropping something off at my apartment, and they thought that they were on the correct street. And I told them, they said, Google Maps tells me I'm here. And I said, you're not here. I'm here and you're not here. So you have to walk one street south. And they said, I don't understand how to navigate one street south. And so I had to, like, draw on the map for them to walk in the way that I was like, this is really odd that they don't understand this. But I assume it's, like, a relic of the fact that they never really learned north, south, like, how to work on a map. They're just following the dot. So that was kind of an apparent example to me. Now that maybe that's naive of me to think, wow, these young kids, they don't know how to navigate. But it is kind of, to be the philosopher, it is like an old story that we hear. So going back to one of the earliest debates about what cognitive effects technology has in Western philosophy is arguably in Plato's Phaedrus, where the character Socrates is very resistant of the new technology of the time, which is literacy. So he says, like, it's very dangerous to be writing words down. So, you know, students will often ask, like, why aren't we reading Socrates? Socrates didn't write anything down. Socrates was essentially illiterate, but his student Plato disagreed with him, ironically, and that's why we have this record of Socrates. But in that Phaedrus, you know, Socrates warns that if we start writing words down, so if we start offloading tools, we're going to become more forgetful. We're not going to remember anything. So he thought this was like one of these core skills. And then he also argues that we're going to become less social, right? We're not going to talk to each other. Why would we talk to each other? There's all these words. We'll just engage with the words. So he had these concerns that you essentially still hear a version of, right? So you're hearing me say, well, you know, if we don't navigate, you know, you're never going to learn how or whatever. You know, Google's making us forgetful. Or social media is making us less social. So some of these questions have been around for a long time. Now, when we look back, we think, well, literacy, of course, is a good thing. We all support literacy. So perhaps, you know, we're scared of the new technology, but it won't turn out to be as harmful as some of those fears suggest.
Yeah. The truth is usually somewhere in the middle. Although sometimes I think, and maybe I've been watching too many dystopian shows, but what if, you know, there's a giant power outage, and can we survive? And it seems like being able to navigate, or I don't know, prepare food without the assistance of Alexa or some kind of AI agent. Those would be good skills to have in a dystopian scenario, but maybe we don't have to go there quite yet.
That's right, though. I think that there are maybe some core set of skills that we want to make sure we develop before we offload. And so determining what those are, I think, could be an important question or research to pursue.
And for sure, in educational settings, what do we think our students need to be able to do on their own versus what can they safely have an AI tool take care of when they're working on assignments, et cetera. I think over to Valerie.
Yeah, Karina, this is a perfect segue actually into my next kind of official question. But what you just said actually made me think of another thing I'd like to know from both of you. And when we talk about cognitive offloading, do we see this, or does the science see this as a complete process? Like, if you've offloaded some kind of knowledge or skill, is it gone, or is it just not actively being used? Do you get what I'm saying? Like your phone number example is a perfect one, right? That, like, I'd say about 10 years ago, I stopped learning phone numbers. But I recently remembered a phone number that I haven't dialed for 20 years. It's just there. It's somewhere in there for no reason. So I think to myself, like, I've offloaded this skill, but some of the knowledge is still there. And I'm kind of curious, like, what do we make of this, if anything?
Carl, do you want to jump in, or should I?
Yeah, I mean, I can, just from a cognitive psychology perspective, I know that there's like some really nice work showing that when we offload, that there is this downside that you may not necessarily remember it later on when you need it. But there are caveats to that. Evan Risco is a cognitive psychologist at Waterloo University who did some really, really neat work on this. But you know, at the end of the day, the things we know that are beneficial for retaining information, thinking about it in ways that's relevant for ourselves, engaging in cognitive processes, adding coding that we're going to need to use when we need to remember it later on. If we're not doing that, then chances are you're not going to remember it. And I think it just comes down to, like, is this something that I think I'm going to need to remember later or not? And I think that's something too that we're not necessarily very good at recognizing sometimes. Like, every time I create a new pet, like the 10th time I created my Apple ID password, I just, like, when you're creating it, it's like, of course I'm going to remember it because you're reading it and it feels very fluent, and I know. And then like 3 hours later when it's gone, right? And so I think it's one of those things where we're going to offload, but then first of all, well, sometimes we don't offload. And I think that's one thing that example highlights is sometimes we don't realize that, like, hey, I need to write that down because I'm going to forget. I think sometimes we overestimate our abilities as well, which I think is like an interesting nuance to all of that as well. But yeah, if we are going to offload, then just thinking to ourselves, am I actually going to need to know this later on or not? And then if I do think I am going to need it to try to do something about that, and you can still offload it, but if you're not working with that information in any meaningful way, it's not going to stick.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So I should be thinking of the apocalypse, what you're saying, to make sure I have the skills that are necessary to survive. I'm just kidding. So Karina, you'd mentioned this kind of long-standing debate about like the effect that kind of technology, so to speak, might have on the way we think and learn and share. I'm curious whether or not you think there's something special about large language models, in other words, like ChatGPT, that makes it more consequential than previous technological developments.
Yeah, great question. So I think there are things that make these large language models special or distinct as a technology. I don't know if they necessarily means that they'll be more consequential, but they'll have their own sort of distinct set of consequences. Let's say something nuanced like that. So they are far more powerful in the sense that they're able to aid us in ways that our other current existing technologies haven't been able to. And they seem to, so for example, they seem to perform very well on some tasks that we in philosophy and I guess in psychology as well have used in the past to measure, like, as benchmarks for progress in AI. So for example, one well-known test is called the Winograd schema. So there it's the idea is like you can change one word in a sentence and it will change the reference of a key and the meaning of a key of the sentence. So example is the police shut down the parade because they advocated violence. And then another sentence is the police shut down the parade because they feared violence. So who is they referring to? In the first sentence, they is referring to the people conducting the parade, right? We know that because we know something about the world and how parades can sometimes lead to violence. But in the second sentence, they is referring to the police because the police are fearing violence. So just by switching the word advocate or fear, right, we've changed the reference of they. So that's actually something that's like quite nuanced. It takes a certain age until humans are able to understand the reference of that. Most adults understand it implicitly, that even though technically the sentence is ambiguous. So they, it's not clear if you just look at the syntax of the referent of they, but the systems now perform very well on these Winograd schemas, whereas early chatbots would fail them. So just the fact that these chatbots are able to have like a little bit more kind of semantic understanding means that we seem to be able to trust them with more nuanced tasks. They also, perform very well. And, one thing that's exciting about language in particular as a kind of benchmark for AI is that language reaches into many different domains. So you can ask chat, in my household, we just call ChatGPT chat. So you can ask chat, a mathematical problem. You can ask chat to come up with a recipe. You can ask chat to explain, the difference between this chemical substance or this other chemical substance. You can ask chat to summarize an article. So language allows us to probe into many different areas of inquiry in a way that something like AlphaGo, which was itself a really powerful system, but it only performed in one narrow area. So it seems, and for that reason, that some people have argued that chat is getting us closer to general intelligence, where we can understand it as being distinguished from narrow intelligence. So something like AlphaGo was a system that was really, really good, arguably superhuman in its performance at playing one game, Go. And if you tested it on anything else, even a different style of Go, because the game of Go is played slightly differently in different traditions, whether it's a Korean tradition or Chinese or Japanese or Tibetan. Even if you move to a different tradition of Go, it would not perform as well. So it was really, really good at a very narrow task. It seems like chat is really good at a large range of things just because of the nature of language. So you can ask it about many different areas. So that sort of move towards a more general system, I think, is extremely powerful. And also makes it slightly more consequential because it can be used for so many different things. It's hard to think about how to regulate it. So the more general purpose the technology is, it's often harder to regulate. And the fact that it's kind of now in the wild, being open to everybody, I think that, suggests that it's going to have a lot of consequences, that it's sort of been released so quickly and is being adopted so quickly with hundreds of millions of users uptaking the technology within a couple months. So yeah, just the kind of power and generality of the system, I think, makes it much more consequential than some of the other technologies that we've seen, and these kind of software applications, at least.
Right. Thank you. It's certainly caused more of a stir than any other kind of advancement that I've noticed, anyways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying about this unprecedented power and flexibility that we're seeing in these new tools, that has also led to a fear response. It's sort of like, we just had a pandemic, now we have ChatGPT, what's next? So people feel a little overwhelmed with the pace of change and the rate of change that is happening around us. And there's a sense that, of being threatened by this. And there are concepts that are familiar to those who like science fiction, like the singularity, will the machines take over and control us? Some of that is in the realm of fiction, but who knows? Maybe science fiction and reality are beginning to blur. So coming back to artificial intelligence versus human intelligence, at this point, and this is a question for both of you, do you think that AI, or in what ways has AI perhaps surpassed human intelligence? How are the two different? How can we tell the difference anymore? Are there things that we're still definitely better at than the machines? And what are those special skills? Or do you think that's an illusion?
I don't know, Karina, did you want to start off with this one?
Yeah, sure. So I'm not too fearful that they're going to take over. For a couple of reasons, which I won't totally go into, but I think the arguments for like existential fears about AI tend to depend on these systems becoming like self-improving, so that the system has to become intelligent enough where it wants to improve its own intelligence over time. And it's not obvious that these systems have that kind of agency or underlying goals. So I would say that's one thing that is important in distinguishing humans from the AI systems we have. So we and other biological intelligences seem to have, so other animals, for example, seem to have like an internal motivations. We want to either succeed or survive or thrive, so forth. It's not clear that these systems have internal motivations, right? So chat is a lot more like Google search engine. It's just sitting there waiting for you to type something and it will give you a nice result. That's really powerful. Don't get me wrong. There's lots of interesting ways we're using these systems. But it's not an agent in the sense that we're used to thinking of agents. It also doesn't seem to have, moral values in the way that humans do. It doesn't seem, I would argue, that it doesn't seem to be creative in the way that humans are. So if we look at the kind of standards of creativity that come out of comparative psychology, so sometimes there's a history of asking like whether or not birds are creative, whether or not monkeys are creative. And there's a strong standard at which comparative psychologists have held animals to, where they, it's usually called something like insightful problem solving. So the animals have to overcome some kind of functional fixedness around how a tool is used and be able to use it in a non-standard way, or reapply the tool, think outside of how the tool is typically used in order to solve some kind of problem. And that seems to require, in the first case, some kind of mental scenario building. So the kind of thing that Carl was talking about. So being able to think through how you might solve a problem before you actually engage in doing so, which is something powerful we seem to be able to have. AI systems might have that, I would suggest, but also something like domain general understanding. So the fact that you can understand that certain tools have certain properties, and so you might want to use like a shoe as a hammer, and in order to do that, I have to understand that the shoe has a certain weight to it, that it has a firm sole, that it can be used to kind of like pound things. So those are all very general properties that abstract away from the fact that the shoe is something I put on my foot. And then to apply those, so to take those general properties and to use them in a different domain or a different problem solving context, that is one in which I need a hammer. So it's not obvious that we have systems that are able to abstract away these general properties like that and apply them into other domains. So that type of like domain general understanding, I think, is something that AI systems don't have yet. There's other things like consciousness, internal experience, aesthetic appreciation, and things like that I think help make us distinct as humans, but maybe not obviously serve like concrete functions in the way that something like domain general understanding does. But yeah, so I think that we're quite different than machines. It's also worth noting that us, along with our animal counterparts, we all have a very long shared evolutionary history. Even systems that we've diverged from really early on our evolutionary tree, like cephalopods and octopuses, they even share features with us that machines don't. So evolution, has given us all these different powers, but also these different constraints. And one of the exciting things about AI is that it doesn't have that shared history. So that means that it's not going to be constrained in the way that we're constrained, which I think is what we want out of a tool. If we really are thinking about it as a tool and not as an agent, then we want a system that can do things that we can't do well. There's lots of things that we can't do well because of different biases we have. So for example, when we look at a small set of objects, we can usually see pretty quickly that there's 5 or 6 objects. And we can see that that's fewer than 12 or 18 objects. But when you have 2 different group sizes, one of 300 and one of 400, even though the disparity is 100, it's hard for humans to gauge sometimes which group is bigger, because that level of group size is not something we're like attuned to assessing. We have kind of a more brute numerical system. Whereas an AI system can just like scan a room, let's say it's an airport, and tell you there's 300 people in the airport right now, or there's 400 people in the airport right now. And sometimes you want that level of precision at that group level, something we can't do very well, but the system can do very well. So it's great to have systems that don't have the constraints we have, because they can fill in the gaps where things that we're not good at. So that's, I think, really powerful. And in those kinds of ways, these systems have surpassed us, but in other ways, they clearly haven't. So, yeah.
Great. I find this very reassuring. I don't know why I feel so threatened, but I guess I want to feel special. And Carl, I'm gonna. We wanted you to speak to this question too, but I also see that there are questions in the Q&A. Sure. Valerie, if you want to kind of curate, because we are close to the end of the hour. So
yeah, and Julia, actually, because you keep coming back to this idea of being afraid of AI potentially, and I really loved Karina's example of Socrates, and that like this is something that, and I don't think AI is anything new. Right? If you think back to like the history of any technological development, whether it's television or the internet, we think it's going to ruin society. We're still here. but that we do have this inherent fascination about what's going to go wrong in the world, right? If you look at you already referred to some of these examples. If you look at literature or television or movies, or if you just do a Google search of dystopian versus utopian future, you could get way more examples for dystopian. We are just fascinated by these things. And we've even done some research in our lab where we just ask people, tell us all the positive, negative consequences of AI for yourself, or all the positive, negative consequences of AI for society. When people think about it from a personal perspective, they list more positive than negative things, right? It's going to help me do my job quicker. It's going to help me get places faster. But when they think about it for the future of society, they're listing more negative than positive things. People are going to lose their jobs. The singularity is going to take over humanity, and so on. And so there is this like fascination that we hold about what's going to go wrong in the world around us, even though our own future, we see it as a very positive, but the rest of the world is going to hell in a handbasket for some reason. And cognitive psychology, we're trying to understand why we look at these things so differently. I think AI is just another example of something that's come along that has relevance for society, and we tend to focus a little bit more on, you look at any newspaper article, it's a little bit of a fear-mongering thing about what's going on with this stuff, where I think from today's discussion we see that there's a lot of positives that come out of these things as well.
That's, again, thank you for talking me out of my neuroses. Valerie, did you have a chance? I can also look at the...
Yeah, there's some really excellent questions, but I'm really conscious of how close we're coming to the end of our session. So I'm actually going to try and take a few of these and combine them into what I think a lot of people are trying to get at with the questions. And that is, how can we balance this cognitive offloading or making use of AI tools with ongoing learning? And I think also learning about these tools enough so that we can use them and think about them critically. So this is kind of an amalgamation of some of the questions I'm seeing right now on the chat.
It's a big question. I'm sorry.
It's a big question. Yeah.
Let me think for a second. So definitely I think over time, like for example, we've gotten much better as a society, or at least maybe I'm speaking of myself as an individual, but I think more broadly of my students as well, of understanding that, what appears on the first page of Google is not necessarily like representative of the internet more broadly, or representative of like what the good answers to the essay questions are, or so forth. So we've developed, perhaps implicitly, some more critical thinking skills around how to use tools like Google, a powerful search engine, and how not to use it. I think that the same thing, through this is still a very new technology, chat, but I think the same thing is going to start emerging, if not that it already has, around when and how we can trust chat. So it's true that chat is a kind of bullshitter, as we say in philosophy. I'm not sure if I mentioned this already or if that was in our pre-discussion. But the philosopher Harry Frankfurt has a book on bullshit, where he analyzes the concept of the bullshitter and says that the bullshitter is much more dangerous than the liar, because the liar still has to track truth, whereas the bullshitter is really just aiming at convincing people. It's just focused on rhetoric. And so in the new iteration of GPT-4, there has been some effort to make GPT give a damn about tracking the truth. But certainly what we've seen from at least my use of chat is that it will make stuff up all the time. And so we have to keep that in mind, for example, when we use it. It's not to say that it wouldn't be useful for crafting an email or writing a love letter or writing poetry, or, there's some things where that tracking of truth doesn't matter as much, where there's other things, if you're asking it for a factual question and expecting some kind of factual answer, that you have to have your guard up as to whether or not you can trust that. Just like any other source you might read on the internet, we've come to realize that there are some sources that care about the truth more than other sources, right? That we could rely on more than other ones. So I think the question of how to be more sort of careful with our use it's going to emerge over time as we start to look at some of the results of ChatGPT more critically. I think people are becoming more and more aware of its biases. So, for example, when you ask it to name 10 famous philosophers, surprise, surprise, they're all Western white males, right? So there's a kind of bias that it's representing in the data. So we're starting to sort of like be more reflective and pick up on some of these things, but because it's such a new tool, I'm not sure that there's like a clear answer on how to engage with it critically yet. I think that's going to come out through this kind of trial and error process, much as it did with the early internet. And we had different search engines, some of which were more reliable than others.
Absolutely. And I think you touched on some things related to ethics, to critical interaction with these tools, how we use them in the context of our democratic institutions and so on. And those would all warrant all separate discussion or 10 thereof. For now, we're out of time. So I want to thank you both so much, Carl and Karina, for giving us your time, for talking, for making your insights accessible to a general audience here at TMU. Thanks also to Alvin and Luke for their technical support, and to the Faculty of Arts for financial support for this event. Thank you. You've given us a lot to think about, and thanks again, and see you soon at another discussion, I hope.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.